Welcome everyone to the 7th episode of Raybees Reviews, where we will be talking about a game that I have been excited to review for quite a while now, and that's Forsaken Realms Vahrin's Call. After seeing some of its early gameplay footage and being hyped about this game for like a few months now, I was pretty excited to get an early access review key from Titan Roc, who are the developers and publishers of this project. Now, I've never played the original Fable before, and I can't speak to how similar VC is to that experience, but I found myself getting quite strong Elden Ring vibes from this game. Obviously at a much smaller scope, but all the good things it does, from its beautiful world design and build diversity, so even some of the bad things like its wonky storytelling and narrative delivery, were all very similar to Miyazaki's magnum opus. Actually, even certain settings like the Southvale Hamlet starting area being similar to Limgrave, the Academy being similar to Raya Lucaria, the game definitely takes its inspiration from Elden Ring and honestly executes on most of it pretty well. While it's not a perfect game and like we'll get into just a little bit, narratively falls to pieces, it more than makes up for it with its beautiful world, fun combat, and addicting progression systems. So let's deep dive into this indie RPG, explore every single facet of it, and then post it up on our tier list here. We'll start off with the plot, and I'll be careful not to drop any spoilers since the game's obviously been out for like a week or so. However, with that being said guys, the plot of Vahrin's Call is easily its worst category. The game is essentially about the small town of Vahrin being overrun by these insectoid monsters, with the peacekeepers, which are basically like the police of the town, essentially crippled and the king dead. The queen has enlisted the help of various mercenaries from throughout the land to help fight off this threat and establish order to the town once more. Now you're essentially playing as one of these mercenaries who've come to Vahrin to make a name for yourself and find riches and glory in the service of the queen. You start off by taking on odd jobs clearing out monsters in the mine before you come into contact with some other surviving peacekeepers and stumble upon a conspiracy that threatens to destabilize Vahrin entirely and put everyone's lives at risk. The rest of the story is how you thwart this mysterious force and save Vahrin from near certain annihilation. Alright, so I'm going to be giving the plot of Vahrin's Call a 3 out of 10. It's easily the most forgettable part of the experience, and I'm honestly debating as to whether or not I should just spoil it for you guys, since the game basically spoils itself not even like halfway through the playthrough. Because of this disjointed Elden Ring-esque storytelling, a lot of what you learn about the story are usually done in cutscenes after a major boss fights or little vignettes of story context scattered throughout the world. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of this kind of storytelling because this usually results in the plot feeling disjointed from the gameplay itself. This is like another problem I have with Elden Ring and like most other Souls games for that instance. The storytelling just feels disconnected and it feels like the story and the gameplay is running on two separate tracks when it should be running congruently. But even this would have been fine if it wasn't for the fact that in chapter 4, keep in mind the game is like 10 chapters long, all of the major characters sit around in a table and basically word vomit the entire plot of the story verbatim. The twist on the final villain would have been really interesting, actually very similar to Elden Ring as well, if the narrative had kept us in the dark for much longer. Without this mystery driving up the stakes, basically 60% of the playthrough feels like you're reading a book where you already know the ending. Now, you can say all you want about how convoluted Elden Ring storytelling is, but the mystery was kept airtight until like the final few hours or so, which helped create massive stakes and tension for finally getting to the end of that mystery and getting that big payoff. Vahrin's Call, on the other hand, just blows its load way too early into the playthrough and you just get a stock standard storybook ending the rest of the way through, which was honestly pretty disappointing. The game could have had a strong narrative backbone, but instead all we got was like an undercooked premise that didn't really have time to marinate properly, shoddy pacing at times, especially at the start of the game, and just bizarre storytelling design that tells us the entire plot of the game not even halfway into the story, making the rest of the playthrough feel just like kinda boring and underwhelming if I'm being honest. So yeah, 3 out of 10. By the way guys, if you guys are enjoying this review style so far, like the video to boost it to other people who might also want a spoiler-free review of Vahrin's Call before they decide to buy it, and subscribe to catch new episodes of Raybees Reviews every single Sunday. Now, back to it. Next up are the characters in Vahrin's Call. Again, this is where I think looking at VC as a Souls game more than an RPG can be beneficial. Because by RPG standards, the character work is dog shit, but by Souls standards, it's not too bad. Whenever you have a game with a mute MC, it falls on the rest of the supporting cast to flesh out the game with a bit of personality and intrigue so the game doesn't just like become a combat simulator. Given how badly the plot fumbles the execution, the character arcs in Vahrin's Call aren't honestly too shabby. Lysa is the definite standout. She's one of the few characters with any sort of personality, carried by a very good voice actress, and her motivation to rescue her superior Raygus drives a large portion of the early game's plot beats. Talscorn, on the other hand, is the strongest member of the Peacekeepers and provides a large bit of backstory into the origins of the final boss and serves as sort of the safe haven and info hub for the mid-game transitions. Outside of these two, there are plenty of side characters that you meet throughout the journey that are all whimsical and quirky in their own right and add a little bit of flavor to your playthrough as well. Now, about the final boss specifically, obviously I'm not going to spoil who it is, but they do suffer a lot because of the storytelling decisions in Chapter 4, but they have a nice bit of contextual lore surrounding them to glean more into their personality. You can get a feel of like a little bit into their motives and how their psyche devolved into what it eventually became. And while I feel like these motives were a little bit murky and not explained like fully, I really enjoyed reading these notes to learn a little bit more about them and just getting a better understanding of the psyche. Ultimately, while the side characters are decent, there's way too few of them to offset the void left by the main character themselves. And this is where Vahrin's Call isn't really an RPG like The Witcher 3 or Kingdom Come Deliverance, but it's more like an Elden Ring or a Black Myth Wukong. You as a player basically have no personality and no voice, which can be a bit frustrating when trying to interact with the world that you've been placed into. When the players aren't an active participant in the narrative and the only development that happens to them are bigger stats and better gear, the story feels hollow, like it only exists in the background as an excuse to progress the combat fantasy further. So off the back of some decently strong characterizations and arcs from like a few of the side characters, I'll be giving the character arcs in Vahrin's Call a 4 out of 10. Moving on to the voice acting, I'd say this is actually the first big win in Vahrin's Call. Now, normally I'm not the biggest fan of Old English being used across the board as like the standard lingo in video games. For example, I thought it completely ruined the immersion in games like First Berserker Kazan, for instance. But in the case of VC, I think the Old English delivery was actually quite befitting for the fantasy medieval world that they were trying to go for, and I think the actors, for the most part, knocked it out of the park. Once again, Lysa was the absolute standout in this game. Her trying to reunite with Raygeus and being willing to like literally murk everything else in her path was the sole anchor throughout the first few chapters. Even in the later chapters, her hot-headedness and brashness threw a spicy curveball to what was otherwise a fairly reserved group of characters. She's honestly the only one with any sort of personality in this game. Talscorn functions well as the head of the Peacekeepers and has that signature authority and presence that make him a much-needed safe haven as the plot progresses and the city starts falling further and further into ruin. I found that the voice acting for some of the side characters was also done pretty well for the most part and helped draw you into their little stories. Now, ultimately guys, the biggest problem with the voice acting was that there wasn't much dialogue in the first place, so even though the voice acting was good, I didn't really get to experience it too much throughout my playthrough. But still, I think I'll give the voice acting in Vahrin's Call an 8 out of 10. The voice acting helped smooth out some of the rough patches of the plot and the limited character arcs throughout the story, and that was very much appreciated. Next up, we'll cover some of the sensory categories, starting with the visuals. Now, straight up guys, I think this game is fucking gorgeous. The stylized, hand-drawn rendition of Vahrin is seriously immersive and gives it a unique identity to hang its hat on. Whether it's the beautiful fields of South Vale, the various caves and mines littered throughout the world, the architecture of the academy or the garrison, or simply just how expansive the palace is, every single major hub has a certain sort of presence and story to it, and that does a great bit of environmental storytelling as you go throughout your first playthrough. This kind of regional variety is the first thing you notice when playing Vahrin's Call, and while it doesn't have the AAA polish, it makes up for it with its original and colorful landscapes. I also enjoy stuff like the spell VFX or the weapons and armor designs in this game. There's a serious sort of like visual progression. When you start out, you just have a bunch of rags on, you look like a crackhead from LA, and by the end of the game you look like some sort of like ethereal paladin. However, the visuals aren't exactly perfect, and this is where I think the indie limitations start to hit. The character models and especially the facial animations are just simply not up to par with 2026 standards. If I'm being honest, it looks like the models from old school RuneScape. Most of the cutscenes just fall flat because it just looks comically bad and dated. This kind of facial jank is really off-putting because a lot of the grim storytelling becomes an afterthought simply because the cinematics cannot support the game trying to take itself too seriously. Honestly guys, there's only so much that the voice acting could do to keep the plot lines together and keep it sort of like coherent and serious, because the rest of the cinematic presentation within this game just really isn't up to par. So with all that being said, I think I'll give the visuals in Vahrin's Call a 7 out of 10. It has a gorgeous and colorfully designed world with some exquisite attention to detail when it comes to flora, biome density, and extremely good weapon and armor designs, as well as like spell animations, but completely drops the ball when it comes to the more cinematic presentations within the story. Moving on to our next sensory category, we have the music and audio within Vahrin's Call. I would say aside from its narrative woes, the general sound design in Vahrin's Call is probably its worst category. There's definitely something off with the general sound engineering and layering, especially within its first few chapters because the game comes off awfully quiet. I would have liked either the atmospheric scoring during the exploration or the combat themes to be a little bit louder so they actually immerse you into the experience. I think maybe the devs were a bit wary of the sound being intrusive and ended up overcorrecting their mixing and layering as a result. But that being said, there's a good mix of tunes for different areas within the game, and I generally enjoyed the exploration music when I could hear it. I wish I could say the same about the combat music, but honestly I wasn't the biggest fan. It doesn't have to be silver for monsters, obviously, but the combat music has to get you hyped for the combat itself, right? But I didn't really get that at all from like the tracks in VC, especially in the middle of combat. The impact and weapon feedback sound design was also a bit off. For about 80% of my playthrough, I played with the greatsword, and I swear to god, the sound on impact just felt like soft for some reason. It didn't really ring like you'd normally expect, and it led to the combat feeling a bit ephemeral and sort of like floaty in a lot of cases. It's really a shame because, like we've discussed, VC doesn't really have the legs to stand on when it comes to the plot, so its combat really needs to tick all the boxes to give it an overall satisfying experience. So I guess I'll give it points for mostly the exploration music and the general musical variety between the zones, but the combat music and the general sound design hold it back, so 4 out of 10. Now, speaking of the combat, let's jump straight into discussing the combat in Vahrin's Call. Now, a lot of pressure is sitting on the combat to make up for the botched narrative design and give the players their money's worth, and I have to say, the combat in Vahrin's Call comes up clutch. Now yes, while it does have a bit of that indie jank and isn't exactly Ghost of Tsushima when it comes to how crisp it is, the combat in Vahrin's Call is still very fun. Since I've never played the original Dark Souls series before, I just started treating this game as an early Dark Souls game with that signature, old school, janky feel, and really started having a lot of fun with it. Despite the jank, there's still some serious depth within some of the later boss fights, largely because of the stamina management. I feel like this is what separates the game from its fabled roots, and it starts taking on more of a Souls inspiration. Having the stamina bar really makes you pace your actions carefully, instead of just the brainless spamming that you have in games like Gothic or Witcher 3. If you don't have an intelligent strategy or setup around stamina management or spell cycling, you will absolutely get murked by some of these bosses. I spent the biggest chunk of my playthrough ramming my head against the fallen champion from chapter 7 because I couldn't find a way to manage my stamina properly, until I just said fuck it and started cheesing him with the run and gun archery style. And this is where the classless build diversity really shines. From a whole host of melee weapons, dual wields, bows, and essentially 5 different types of magic, VC really does take up after Elden Ring with just how much variety there is in approaching the combat. Obviously not to the same scope, but it's similar vein. While I'm not the biggest fan of magic in my games, you can realistically fuse all 3 styles together and create a hybrid style of combat centered around all 3 types. Now, while the boss design is generally very nice, I felt like the level variety and especially the mob distribution in Vahrin's Call is where the combat falters completely. I swear to god, about 80% of the combat is against the 3 same kind of mobs over and over and over again. You have these weird void crawlers that act like mindless zombies, and then you have your traditional humanoid, melee, and range foes. The game does have some cool monster designs with very unique attacks that you have to plan around, but I feel like there were kind of few and far in between. So I got after like chapter 6, I was constantly fighting these dumbass void zombies. They made up for like 90% of the mob placement within the higher levels, and it was honestly just boring to have to get through them over and over again. Every level should have felt more like having to maneuver through the puzzle of systematically dispatching the mobs with like different kind of weapons, but instead the experience in most of the levels in Vahrin's Call is just like running past all the zombies to clear out the range mobs first and then AoE down those zombies later on. Rinse and repeat this over and over again, and clearing the levels just became kind of uninteresting after a while. It's like the same playbook ran over and over again, which made the levels itself kind of boring, even though the bosses were obviously fun. So yeah, although it fumbles the regular mobs, the boss fights, the build diversity, and the vintage soul skill expression is still very much intact. And if you can find it within yourself to treat the game like an old Dark Souls instead of a smooth hack and slash RPG, I think you'll get a lot out of what it has to offer in terms of combat. 7 out of 10. Speaking of what it has to offer in terms of combat, let's jump into the systems and progressions for a bit. And straight off the bat, the progression in this game is simply perfect. There are no lapses in your power curve. You never feel too strong or too weak at any point during the playthrough, especially even in the late game, which I think is just like a masterstroke of power design. I've routinely come across games, even some of my personal favorites, that can't calibrate their power curve properly, so I was very happy that VC pulled it off without a hitch. And as far as systems go, it's just your traditional open world RPG designs. I appreciate that Vahrin's Call auto-allocates basic stats like health, mana, and stamina on level up, so you're only worried about the more fun aspects of progression like what weapons to use or which corresponding skills to spec into, which was honestly very refreshing. It's so much more fun mulling over the active skills that have more dynamism in your gameplay instead of pulling out a fucking Excel sheet and calculating what health level you need to get to clear a certain boss or something. I never really fuck with that kind of annoying minutia because I feel like it takes away from like the fun gameplay aspect of playing just like any video game. Also, I was absolutely in love with the use-based progression system. You level up your weapons by actively using them, which is so much more immersive and makes you an active participant in your combat journey. I suppose my only gripe with how this system was implemented was that too much of each individual skill tree was predicated on finding the corresponding skill books for each weapon or magic type. You kind of have to explore the map and find these skill books, which essentially ties skill unlocks with exploration. While I don't necessarily have a problem with this, as we'll get into later, I do think the ratio could have been evened out just a little bit. Because currently, I'd say roughly 60 to 70% of unlockable skills have to be found through exploring, and I would have liked a more 50-50 split. Like 50% you just get through leveling up passively, and 50% you have to unlock by exploring. Maybe they could have locked the more powerful spells behind exploration. I think that could have worked also. That honestly would have been fun and really encouraged people to interact with the world without feeling like you have to run around the map to progress your combat, which, again, it's a little bit disorienting and unintuitive. I like doing combat to level up combat. If exploring can unlock some secret spells, that's cool, but like, I want most of my combat upgrades to come through with actively engaging in combat. Aside from that, I didn't really use the trapping or like any of the heavy hitting magic spells in my playthrough, so I won't really offer too much of a comment on that. Trapping seemed fine in the spare times that I did use it, but aside from a bit of fun cheesing, it honestly seemed kind of pointless, especially on like standard difficulty. There's like literally no reason why you should be using trapping unless you just fuck with that kind of playstyle. And as for magic, I used it primarily to augment my weapons, but magic usually takes a bit of an investment before you can start reaping the big combat rewards, and I couldn't really bother with it too much. But what I did bother with and found really interesting was the alchemy system. It was super cool how you can just create your own custom potions depending on your alchemy level and what kind of threat you were up against. For example, when I fought Dirk, I made a potion that increased both my health as well as my resistances to slash and pierce, so I would stop getting one-shot by his attacks. When I fought the Fallen Champion, which honestly is the toughest boss in the game, I ran a health plus stamina regen potion so I could move and dodge freely without getting CC chained by some of his big combos. I see a lot of people talking about how you can even throw potions to inflict debuffs, and while that's a nice bit of fun cheese, I couldn't really get it to work in the bigger boss fights, especially later in my playthrough, when I feel like the fights are moving just a little bit too fast to just like pop out a potion and like throw it at an enemy. You literally don't have the time for that, especially the final two bosses. Nevertheless, this whole custom potion thing is something that I've personally never seen before, and it was such a brilliant addition to the combat. Unfortunately guys, even though I want to, I can't really give this category a perfect score because of the upgrade system. The upgrade system in Vahrin's Call is redundant and just like utterly useless. Unless you're stuck on a boss and or you reach the final boss, there's literally no reason to start upgrading your weapons or armor. They cost a lot of golden mats, it's a very pedantic process with like lots of running around, and sooner or later you're gonna stumble into a weapon in the open world that's simply just like better than your current upgraded weapon. Now, as long as I've been playing RPGs, I've never really liked this kind of redundancy because it just makes the whole upgrading process feel like a waste of fucking time. I would have much preferred it if we start off with a basic level 1 version of each weapon and then systematically upgrade it with each chapter progression. You can even have like many different variants of the same weapon, similar to something like in Black Myth Wukong. So players can have different playstyles even within the same weapon. I think that would have been a lot more efficient in terms of system design instead of like going through the trouble of upgrading a fucking weapon and then finding some random shit that just like outspecs it completely, and it makes you feel like you just wasted your time, you know what I mean? So off that one slide, I'll be giving the progression systems a 9 out of 10. It runs the standard RPG setup, trivializes the more basic stats like health and stamina for more fun weapon skills, and has a genuinely interesting take on alchemy with custom potions, but ultimately loses that single point for just how misleading and useless the armory is for upgrading your weapons and armor. With our combat systems covered, let's talk a little bit more about the world design in Vahrin's Call. Now, coming into this game, world design was my biggest question mark regarding this game, and it ended up being what I was most pleasantly surprised by. From various side quests to exploration, there's a metric shit ton of stuff to do, and each biome is packed with tons of content. Like I said earlier, I think the skill books were definitely a good idea, and although I think they could have been a little bit more balanced in placement, it still feels pretty damn good stumbling onto one of these for the weapon that you're currently using. There's also these notes scattered throughout the world that give some lore context to the main story plot, which is very reminiscent of games like First Berserker Kazan. While it doesn't fix the storytelling catastrophe of Chapter 4, it's nice to get these little nuggets of context before big boss fights. Now, moving on to things that I didn't really enjoy, the NPC behavior and reactivity was lacking for the most part. I think it was par for the course for the game being an indie, but aside from the gorgeous layouts and the visuals of the open world, the world didn't really feel inhabited by actual people, which was kind of sad, but again, ultimately understandable. I'm still gonna take points off for it, but I can see why. Obviously, like, they have budgetary limitations and they can't quite model the AI to have like realistic portrayals of people. But perhaps my biggest problem for this category is just the sheer redundancy of all the loot in this game. Yes, this world is jam-packed with stuff, but I'm telling you guys, about 60 to 70% of it is mostly useless. It has the Witcher 3 problem of literally everywhere you look, there's an item that can be grabbed, and you'll default to grabbing it because you'll probably go, well, what if I have to use it at some point? But that point never fucking comes, and you end the game with a whole Costco worth of crap in your inventory. While I appreciated the stuff like chests and skill books, the standard upgrade mats you find are just straight up overwhelming and pedantic to collect, and 90% of the time, they rarely serve your build. I said this before in my Witcher 3 review, but when you have too many items, every single item becomes proportionally less important until you have an inventory full of stuff that you should have never collected in the first place. So yeah, the game nails its side quests and exploration for the most part, but fumbles when it comes to having reactive NPCs and just filling the world with meaningless garbage. 7 out of 10. With all of that game design stuff out of the way, let's start closing out the review with the general quality of life in Vahrin's Call. I feel like this is where it gains the most separation from games like Elden Ring because it's a very seamless and honestly fun playthrough. There's no useless grind or friction throughout any of your playthrough, everything feels buttery smooth and you can freely swap between quests and exploration without feeling like you're going through some sort of checklist. Like I said earlier in the systems category, a lot of the combat systems and designs are all very intuitive and streamlined, so you can simply progress the story, experiment with different styles without ever needing to think about looking up some sort of wiki to understand leveling breakpoints or having to watch a video because the narrative delivery was like too convoluted or something. I would say my one big problem in this department was the general map design. Even though I sorta got the hang of it later I got into the playthrough, early on it was very difficult to discern the elevation and I wasted a lot of time just running around in circles because I couldn't figure out how the fuck to break into the next zone within a certain chapter. Even though it does have an elevation toggle, I didn't really find it too useful and routinely ended up getting stuck over and over again, which was pretty annoying. Another small problem I encountered early on was the traversal, especially jumping. The default jump is really a piece of shit, and the game forces you to have a running start before you attempt any sort of like platforming across certain zones. While I sort of acclimated to it like after chapter 3, honestly after that it never really bothered me. The first 2 chapters were really annoying. Like it's so misleading just how small the jump is, and like basic things that you hope to clear with like a single jump, you need like a running start to actually clear, which is just a bit pedantic in my opinion. So all in all, I'll be giving the quality of life section an 8 out of 10. It's a very seamless and intuitive playthrough. It streamlines all the boring style calculation elements of a traditional Souls and focuses more on the dynamic skills. And aside from like map navigation and like some platforming issues, the game really doesn't waste your time. And wrapping up with my overall enjoyment playing this game, I think 7 out of 10 is a solid score for Forsaken Realms' Vahrin's Call. It's a very fun, colorful RPG with a bit of nostalgic Souls combat. It has an excellent classless combat system, seamless progression, and an intuitive progression system that focuses on dynamic skills while automating the more basic stats. Its open world is jam-packed with fun side quests and very meaningful skill upgrades, even though the devs did overdo it a little bit by adding a lot of useless junk into the world. For all of the good that it does systematically, it heavily screws up its narrative structure and doesn't do a good job of maintaining intrigue and stakes going into the mid-game, which effectively makes the playthrough feel boring by the time you hit like late game because you essentially know exactly what's gonna happen. It also hits its indie limitations specifically when it comes to like cinematic presentation or NPC world immersion, but honestly guys, I think it does enough things pretty well, especially for an indie game, that it wasn't really a major sticking point for me personally. For anyone who's looking to get their fix of Fable before the official remake drops next year, or anyone looking for some old school Souls combat that's reminiscent of the early days, then I think you will have a lot of fun with Vahrin's Call. Now, with all that being said, let's add up our scores. Plot, 3 out of 10. Characters, 4 out of 10. Voice acting, 8 out of 10. Visuals, 7 out of 10. Music and sound, 4 out of 10. Combat, 7 out of 10. Progression systems, 9 out of 10. World design, 7 out of 10. Quality of life, 8 out of 10. And overall enjoyment, 7 out of 10. And this brings us to a total score of 64, ranking it just below First Berserker Kazan and definitively above Gothic Remake. And now, it's on you guys. What do you all think of my scores, and what would you have given to each category? What are some of the good or bad things that VC does that you think I couldn't get to in this video? And if you haven't bought the game already, where are you leaning now that you've watched this entire video? Let me know what y'all think, and while you're down in the comments, like the video to boost it to other people who might also be looking for a full spoiler-free breakdown of the game before they buy it, and subscribe to catch new episodes of Raybees Reviews every single Sunday. I'll leave my playlist here just in case you guys missed any of the previous episodes. Personally, I would highly recommend you guys start out with my Witcher 3 breakdown. I'll see you guys there. Peace.